occasionally issues around the history of the Old Testament hit the news. And so I actually thought I was going to start by asking a question, which is, have you heard about the camel debate? Anyone? Yes, some of you heard about the camel debate. No? So this is last year, one of those rare times when the historicity of the Old Testament actually made it onto some popular websites, news sites, Facebook even, because of a discovery of some camel bones. So I have here, I grabbed two, just Googled and grabbed two headlines off the internet. The two that I grabbed because in their headlines they fairly clearly give away their position. There was a whole range in between. But so you have from The Guardian, you have headline, "The Old Testament's made-up camels are a problem for Zionism." And then you have from Answers in Genesis, "The Bible wins the debate with carbon-dated camel bones." So it's kind of, kind of interesting, this issue of the camels, which popularly kind of hit this whole, this proves that the Bible is wrong and this proves that the Bible is right. And what do we do in the middle? How do we, I don't know much about camel bones. I don't know about you. How do we respond to that? But the reason I raise it is because I think this issue actually raised for me a number of the issues that I think are going on behind the scenes that I want to talk about tonight. I should say I don't necessarily consider myself an expert on the topic of the historicity of the Old Testament. I've been teaching Intro to Old Testament for about 10 years and I've done a little bit of teaching the Pentateuch, so it's an issue that comes up. I've read about it, thought about it, but it's not my main area of research or anything like that. So I'm hoping I can start a conversation. I don't pretend to have all the answers to all the questions. I don't know if anyone does, but we'll see where we go. But for me, this issue of the camels kind of raised what I think are some of the issues behind the scenes. So the first thing you have is archaeology. So you have this archaeological evidence, and people have been digging in Israel and they have found some camel bones. That's the archaeological evidence, bones of camels. And particularly these bones appear to have weak knees. So from the bones, they see that these camels were weak-kneed camels, or when they died, had weaker knees. So that's the evidence from archaeology. And I think what gets confused in the kind of populist level debate and, heralding of the proving or disproving of the Bible might be what that actually means. So it's like, we've discovered this, that disproves the Bible. Well, not quite. The archaeological evidence is that there are camel bones with weak knees. That evidence then needs to be interpreted. So there's interpretation of the archaeological evidence, which I think sometimes people forget. That's a pretty important step. What does this evidence mean? So apparently, according to those who know more than me about camel bones, weak knees indicate that these camels were load-bearing camels, yes? So therefore they had people who actually placed things on them and made them walk around carrying heavy objects, including people. Therefore these camels were domesticated. So it becomes a debate about the domestication of camels and at what point in history humans domesticated camels in this part of the world. So that's the interpretation of the evidence. Now, it might be really obvious in that case, unless there was a whole bunch of camels that had some knee disease. It seems fairly likely that that's a good interpretation of the evidence, but it is an interpretation of the evidence nonetheless. The other interpretation of the evidence is around the dating, and this is probably something that you've talked about in other topics, and again, not something I know all the ins and outs of, but obviously there is the interpretation of the archaeological evidence in terms of how old are these camel bones. So radiocarbon dating, setting a date for these bones, and therefore interpreting that these camels who were domesticated died at a particular point in history. I actually think there's a third step before we can get even into this debate. So you've got the archaeological evidence, you've got the interpretation of it. I think there's actually a third step that goes beyond interpretation, what I would call extrapolation. From that interpretation, we actually extrapolate further. So the extrapolation is, we have found domesticated camels from this point in history, therefore there were no domesticated camels prior to this point in history. That's actually not just interpreting the evidence, that's extrapolating from your interpretation. We haven't found any camels that we can date older than this that appear to be domesticated, therefore there weren't any. Now that might be good extrapolation, it might be a bad extrapolation. What is it, how they say? Absence of evidence is not evidence of absence. But it's not necessarily bad extrapolation either. We haven't found any. So there's kind of those three steps in terms of the archaeological evidence itself. On the other side, you then have the text, the biblical text, the textual evidence, which talks about camels, or mentions camels. Way back in Genesis, Abraham is said to have had camels that he and his family used to carry their loads, i.e. were domesticated. Similarly, I think there are a number of steps we need to think about, or issues behind the issue, before we can trumpet, that the Bible does or doesn't is proved or disproved by this archaeological evidence. So the text itself, again, I think there's a question of the evidence. What does the text actually claim about camels? Because the text is not about camels. I don't know if you've read Genesis lately, but it's not a treatise on camels and the domestication of the camel. That's not what it's about. There are references to camels in the stories, the narratives of the Old Testament, but that's not quite the same thing. So the evidence we have is mention of camels rather than anything bigger than that. Then again, I'd say there's a second step with the text, interpreting the text, hermeneutics. What kind of text is this? And how do we interpret the mention of camels? Do we interpret it to mean that everybody back then in Abraham's day had domesticated camels, this was a common thing? Or is this, to be interpreted in some other way? Some people would suggest Abraham's not actually from Israel. So there's no argument from the scriptures that there were domesticated camels in Israel at this point in history, which is what the archaeologists say they have shown is not the case. So it may be that the text is interpreted as suggesting that there were domesticated camels in another part of the world where Abraham came from, possibly. So there's issues of interpreting the text or hermeneutics. And again, I would say there's probably, for me, a third step. This kind of, I didn't know quite what to call it, but what kind of text is this? And is the truth of the story, and when I say story, don't mishear me to mean fictional, I don't mean that at all, but the narrative, is the truth of the narrative of Abraham dependent on those kind of details? That's a third question that's behind, that I think is behind it. So if it turned out that there were no camels, let's not even say domesticated camels, there were no camels, does that mean the story is untrue? Is that the nature of the text? And there are certainly people who would argue there are lots of other ways of understanding the nature of the text, that it may be that the text, maybe that the text is written from stories that are told orally over a long period of time, that it is quite possible that language that is used when the story is written down is not exactly the same as the way language was used at the time the events took place. Animals in the Bible are notorious, actually, the words for animals in the Old Testament are notoriously difficult to translate. If you've read through Job lately, the last few chapters of Job, you'll notice there's a lot of footnotes where it says, we think it means this animal, but it actually could be some completely different animal because, the names that people give to things over a long period of time, we're kind of not exactly sure what they're talking about. Same in the Psalms, you have, a psalmist will differentiate between what we translate as the lion and the mountain lion, and I go, and the difference between a lion and mountain lion to me. So there are a number of different ways of thinking about what the text is, the nature of the text, how it's interpreted, but more than that, how it expresses truth. I'm not trying to give you an answer on the camel question. What I'm trying to say is it actually raises a whole host of issues about how archaeology is treated and how it's understood, how it's interpreted, what's extrapolated from it, and how the text is treated. And so for me, those are some of the issues I thought were good introductory background ones to what I want to talk about tonight. So, where am I? So as I said, topic is historicity of the Old Testament, and you'll probably get from me a little bit of hermeneutics of the Old Testament and theology of the Old Testament thrown in because that's really, where I'm most comfortable, and I think you can't talk about one with the other, but understand that's the topic I've been asked to talk about, so we'll do my best. So just to give you an overview of where I want to go with this, I thought it would be useful to talk about the nature of the Old Testament text, how it works, then what we know about the world of the Old Testament when it takes place, a little bit about archaeology and dating and evidence and that side of it, and then some general assumptions about history and historicity and the role of faith in all of this. So that's my kind of broad overview. I'm aware that particularly when I get to, really for many of these issues, my assumption is there are probably people sitting in the room who want each of these topics know more than me. So that's great, and hopefully we can have a conversation about it later. As I said, I don't pretend to have all the answers, but hopefully can pull it together in a way that gets us thinking. So I'll move on from that. I have a few photos to show you just to keep it interesting from our trips to Israel. So we took a group from here, and I've been a couple of other times. So as I said, the first thing I thought is worth talking about is the nature of Old Testament narrative. So particularly, as Matt said, we're talking about the period from about Abraham to David. So you're talking Genesis 12 through Exodus, Leviticus, Joshua, Judges. into Kings. Kings is where it starts to get a bit easier. I think Kevin did a blurb for tonight and kind of made that point that once we get into the book of Kings, it becomes a lot easier to find evidence for the dates of events, and the events of the Old Testament start to interact with the events of other world history that we have knowledge about. So really it's that period of Abraham to David, if you like, where most of the questions get raised, and where, not often, but sometimes, things like that hit the news saying we've disproved the Bible or we've proved the Bible, and I'm not sure that it's quite that simple. So the Old Testament narratives, I find probably most helpful for me to have in mind as I'm talking about this is kind of Genesis 12 to 50, that kind of Abraham, Jacob stories. It works for any of them, but that's relatively well-known kind of stories, just to kind of have in your mind. First thing I would say about those narratives is I would talk about the difference between history and historiography. So historiography means written history. The Old Testament is, on one level, historiography. It's not history or pure history. I don't know if there is such a thing as pure history. I have to ask the historians in the room. But pure history is, we're living it, I guess. It's the events that are actually taking place. Nobody can write down an account of pure history. For starters, there would not be enough books in the world to contain it. If you're going to write down everything that ever happened, that you write the history of what's happened in this room for the last 15 minutes would probably take you a book. In terms of all the interactions, if you're talking pure history, either that or you just have a list of dates, kind of thing. But even then, you have to choose what you put in, what do you leave out. You have to be selective. And nobody tells history from a purely unbiased point of view, because there is no such thing as an unbiased observer in life. All of us are participants in life and participants in history. We all come from a particular perspective. So I would argue there's no such thing as pure history. Now, on my definitions I'm using here, people study history, so there must be something like that. But what we have in the scriptures is historiography. That is, it is written down, so therefore in the writing of it there are choices made, what to include, what not to include, what perspective to take, what perspective not to take. What to, tell us a lot about, what to tell us a little bit about, where to focus our interest. And I would suggest that the Old Testament is unashamedly biased in its telling of history, in its historiography. In fact, it is deliberately, if you want to call it biased. It has an agenda. It isn't just trying to set out the history of the nation of Israel from Abraham to David. It has a theological agenda, and is unashamed about that. And so I don't think I need to be ashamed about that. As a person who believes the Bible, I don't think I need to be ashamed about the fact that the Bible has an agenda. I actually think most historiography, I don't think I would hesitate. I'd say all historiography has an agenda, whether it's an acknowledged agenda or not. And the Scripture's agenda is very much acknowledged. So the agenda of Scripture, or the nature of it, is theological. The goal is the presentation of the actions of God within history, the interactions of God with his people and their interactions with him. So that, say more than that actually, not just the presentation of God's actions, the presentation of God's actions within human history, so that people might respond to God. So there's actually not just a presentation agenda, if you like, but there's a goal, and there's a purpose for which it was written, which is to persuade, which is to call for response. It is actually to engage people in this story and to get them to choose to enter into it and accept the truth of it. So the goal is not to set forth history, and I really stress it's in the way that I teach the Old Testament, because I do find that some students will come with that kind of sense of, I want to study the Old Testament so that I can prove that what it says happened. And I think if we do that, we're missing the point of the Old Testament. It doesn't set out to prove that what it says happened. It sets out to call us to respond to the God whom it presents to us, working in the lives of people then and wanting to work in the lives of people now. And taking that right perspective of it, I think, is really important. So asking the right questions of the text is really important. I don't think there's any of my students in the room. I'm sure that some of my students leave my lectures entirely frustrated because I haven't answered that big burning question they had, because I'm far more interested in saying what are the questions the text is interested in answering rather than the questions we are necessarily interested in answering. Not that there's anything wrong with our questions, but if we want to interpret the text well, we need to focus on the questions it seeks to answer. So getting the focus right, looking for what it does address rather than what it doesn't. as I've just said, I don't think there's anything wrong with asking the questions of historicity. This is the first time I've been along here tonight, but I love the name reasonable faith. This idea that it's good to provide a foundation of reason for the faith that we have. And I would definitely say that the scripture needs a basis in history to be true. Absolutely, we need to have that foundation. But it does mean that the answers we come up with, or the answers we can come up with to some of our questions, will be by definition partial and provisional, because we cannot make the text something other than what it actually is. So I would suggest that reading the Old Testament for the purpose of proving its historicity is actually reading against the nature of the text. It's looking for the text to do something that it's not just that it's not doing, but that is not its agenda. Like, it has an agenda and we're reading it with a different agenda. Doesn't mean we can't look into the issues, but I think it's worth keeping that as an overarching framework. And so my best example of this, I think, is just recognising sometimes what the biblical text does and doesn't claim. So sometimes I'll find students in my classes, and I'm sure that I probably do this too sometimes, it's almost like trying to defend something in the Bible that I'm not sure the text is asking you to defend. So stupid example, but Abraham, he's a bit stupid sometimes. Now I'm saying stupid example. He goes down to Egypt in the story, and Pharaoh asks him about Sarah, his wife, and he lies and he says that Sarah is his sister. And people try and defend that and, sort of explain why that's okay that Abraham did that. I don't actually think the text is asking you to do that. You don't need to defend something just because it's in the text. That's not how the nature of the text works, yeah? It's kind of obvious when you get to the New Testament, things like I don't know anyone who tries to defend what Judas did. But that idea, sometimes we get with the Old Testament that if it's in there, then we have to defend what it says rather than understanding how it works. So I think the text is highlighting for us that Abraham is doing the wrong thing, and therefore we don't need to defend him. And so that's kind of a stupid example. Maybe a more serious example was my biggest problem with Dawkins' book, The God Delusion. I don't know how many of you have read it, but his chapter on Judges, or his chapter where he addresses Judges, I was really mad at him because I'm reading it going, I've got better arguments against the Old Testament than this. I've got better questions that I don't have answers to. But basically the way he presented it, and I was going to grab it off the shelf today to reread it, but it's been a little while. But basically my recollection of the way he presents it is he looks at some of the stories in the book of Judges and the terrible things that happen. There's a prostitute who gets murdered and her body cut into pieces and spread throughout the land. And he says, this is the God that the Bible kind of endorses, is this cruel and horrific God who not that the Bible endorses, the Bible portrays a cruel and horrific God who endorses this kind of behaviour. And I just have you read Judges? There is no indication in the text of Judges that God endorses that behaviour. In fact, if you understand the purpose and the nature of Judges as theological, the whole point of the book of Judges is that this is what happens when people disobey God and go away from God. So it's quite a problem in that book, and I'm not the only one who's pointed it out. That is kind of asking Christians to defend something that the Bible doesn't ask us to defend, if that makes sense. Funnily enough, I think even if you take a really liberal view of Scripture, which I don't, but even if you kind of take away the theological and just treat Judges as kind of a political agenda, his argument still doesn't hold, because the political agenda of Judges, if you argue it that way, seems to be that having a judge doesn't work, we need a king. And there's an argument that the book of Judges is written kind of to promote the idea of kingship. Even then, the whole point of the book of Judges is this is what happens when we don't have, this is bad, not this is good. So anyway, so sometimes I think that's worth thinking through. Are we seeking to defend something in the text that the text itself doesn't actually claim? And that may, for me, be part of the issue with the camel debate. I'm not sure that the story hinges on the domestication of camels in Israel in the second millennium. As I said, certainly Abraham doesn't come from Israel, so trying to not overread it and think that it says something that we then have to defend when maybe it actually doesn't say that. I hope that makes sense. And I hope this isn't too disjointed. I feel I've just throw a few different strands of thoughts and see how they all come together at the end. The next thing I thought was worth addressing was, I guess, in terms of the historicity of the Old Testament, starting to think about what can we affirm. So I've kind of given you all the things that we don't necessarily need to affirm or can't. What can we affirm? My starting point is not actually with archaeology. I would start with what we know of the world of the Old Testament. So the world of the text, or the world of the ancient Near East. So what we know about what was happening in that part of the world in that period of history, very big period of history. So the theological narratives, the recounting of events, are grounded in history and founded on what happened in people's lives and what happened in the nation's life. The problem we're always going to have with individual stories of people is a little bit like, well, maybe it's different now because of the internet, but certainly before the internet, if I tried to kind of get you to prove the events of my childhood, it would be very difficult for you to do because nobody wrote a book about my childhood. I wasn't a famous child. There's nothing. Even now with the internet, I'm not sure that you would be able to find much out. So in terms of individual people's lives, we can't prove the existence of an individual person from, like, as I said, me, other than the fact I'm standing here, in that kind of sense. So what we're really talking about is the world. So if I told you about my childhood, growing up in the 1980s, and I told you about the fluoro socks that I used to wear to school as a primary school child, if you're around my age, which doesn't seem like there too many people are, you'd be like, yeah, that fits with what I remember of the 80s. That's something that people did then. If I told you what school I went to, which was in New South Wales, and you could go to New South Wales and you go, yeah, there is a school called that. So the world that I am telling the story of, kind of, it fits with your experience of reality, with what you can kind of prove, what you can make sense of. That, for want of a better word, lends credibility to my story and makes you think, yes, that is quite likely. The world that you're describing is the world that we know of from that time period. So even though we may not have evidence elsewhere of your particular life story, the world you're describing fits in it. Does that make sense, that kind of analogy? I think that's similar to what we do with the Old Testament. I've got the text itself, obviously, that tells us these stories of people's lives. But if we're asking the question of how does that fit into what else we know of the world of the time, well, there isn't references in ancient texts to Abraham, or to Jacob, because it's a pretty obscure place that they're living in, and they're pretty obscure people. But the details of their stories, I would suggest, do seem to fit what we know of the world at the time, what people call the milieu of the setting. So the general customs and concepts that are known to us from other writings of that time and place, so Babylonian, Sumerian, Akkadian, Egyptian, that kind of thing. What we have from them, and what we have in the Old Testament scriptures, from comparing the two, I would think a good case is made that the world reflects what we know of it. The world of the text reflects what we know of the world from other sources. Side note on those other sources, these Egyptian and Sumerian and Babylonian and Akkadian documents we have as well, it's worth noting that none of them are pure unadulterated history as well. They are all entirely biased and have an agenda and have a perspective and are selective in the same way, that the Old Testament is selective and biased. They are too. They may not always acknowledge their bias. Sometimes they're totally upfront in acknowledging their bias. So some of them are written for political agendas, theological agendas, to get people to worship their gods, to get people to submit to their king, whatever it is. So again, sometimes the danger of, saying, oh, well, we need to kind of judge the Bible against everything else that we know, as if everything else that we know is unbiased and historical and scientific, and the Bible is the thing that needs to be matched up against them. Not quite the case. So I think the Old Testament fits within what we know of the milieu comfortably, and there's probably two main areas of work that have been done on this. More probably in the last 50 to 100 years, there's been quite a bit of work done on the customs of the time. So from the other ancient writings, what do we know of the kind of behaviours and practices of the time, and do they seem to line up with the behaviours and practices of the Old Testament? And then more recently, I brought a couple of books because I found these really helpful. It's definitely not my area of expertise. So that's this kind of book, studying the ancient Near East, the ancient Israelites, their customs and their practices. But this is what I find really interesting. John Walton's got a book, The Ancient Near Eastern Thought. So actually trying to look at the conceptual world of the time. So what do we know about the worldview of people then, of how people kind of thought about things and understood the world and saw things, and does the presentation of that, or the implications of that in the Old Testament text, seem to fit what we know from elsewhere? So customs and kind of concepts are the way that I've talked about it. So a couple of examples. Now I'm trying to remember if I've got, just let me see, no, not yet. A couple of examples of that, the Nuzi texts, the Mari texts. I know some of you, very familiar, some of you may not at all. So the Nuzi texts are from 15th century, so second millennium BC, Akkadian records discovered in Iraq in the 1920s. And they sort of talk about a number of practices of the time, so customs and ways that life was done. So things like someone who didn't have a child adopting adopting a slave in place of a son, which is what Abraham tries to do. And, then he has a son, so it's all a bit of a moot point. But, that kind of idea that was just a known custom, to us that might seem weird, that seems to fit in that period in history, in that milieu quite well. The transfer of the birthright. So the story of Jacob and Esau, the idea that you could actually sell it and transfer it. We might be tempted to read it and go, that's, seems a bit weird, but that is a kind of a known custom or practice from the day. The possession of household gods. So Rachel in the story, and they have these, these little gods that she takes with her when they move, so those kind of practices and behaviours from different place, different time, but relatively speaking, historically speaking, same part of the world, kind of same general milieu, seem to reflect similar kinds of customs. The Mari texts, I think, are a really interesting example of the slowness of archaeology and also how our history influences on what we can know about ancient history. So Mari texts discovered at a place called Mari in 1933 at a place on the Euphrates River, which is modern Syria. The book that I was reading was saying as of 2005, it's less than half excavated. I'm really intrigued to know, as of today, is it even still there? Has it been destroyed? Who knows? But, so we're talking, it's been, 33, what's that, 85 years, 80 years. And still, there's kind of really slow progress of even finding the evidence, let alone trying to interpret it and understand what it means and extrapolate from it. But at that point, they'd found at least 25,000 clay tablets in Akkadian, dated to the early second millennium, so even older than the Nuzi texts. So getting kind of more to the period where it seems that the Genesis, Abraham stories seem to fit. And again, you have some kind of customs, things like the double portion being given to the oldest son, so each son being given a blessing and the double portion being given to the oldest son, which is in Deuteronomy. Similar names of people and places, which there's like a whole area of historiolinguistics, which, you go, wow, that's good on those people for doing all that work, because I wouldn't want it to be me. But studying kind of how language develops over time, and therefore the names we give for places and the names we give for people can often reflect the time in which they took place. And so doing work on that and saying, yeah, the names seem to fit. I think I have a great example of that. My name is Melinda. I pretty much can guarantee when I meet a Melinda that she's within 5 years of my age, because my name is a name that just, it had its moment. And it really hasn't had one before or since. It's like the Kylies that I meet. I go, oh yeah, I went to school with a bunch of Kylies, you're probably about my age too. But Britneys are usually a little bit younger. Anyway, you get the point. Yeah. So that kind of work that's been done on language, on names particularly, names of places and people. Interesting in the idiom of covenants and how covenants were made. So the Hebrew word for making a covenant is actually literally the word to cut a covenant. So when you make a covenant, you don't make it, you cut it. Possibly from the Bible, there isn't a sense of cutting in the ceremony in Genesis 15, but actually from these texts, that's actually just a known idiomatic phrase. Like we use certain words for certain phrases at certain periods in history. That's kind of the slang, to put it in a modern term, but the idioms of the day seem to be reflected. And other practices as well. In terms of concepts, so this kind of stuff with Walton, he talks about things like the way that dreams were understood. So dreams weren't understood as, the way that we understand them as related to your psychology or your, what's happened in your day or your fears or, your that kind of thing. But dreams were understood as messages from the gods or from other worlds and other realms. That kind of shifts in thinking that take place over a long period of time in different cultures seems to kind of be reflected in the biblical text from what else we know. Rituals, prophecy, even things like how the world exists. So understandings of things like, the pillars of the earth, and that kind of idea that's just a nice King James phrase to us, but that there was actually a concept or a worldview in people's minds that the world existed standing on pillars, which I joke with my students, my concept of the world, some of you in this room would laugh at, because my concept of the world is like primary school textbook, solar system, kind of thing. The framework we have for viewing the world isn't right or wrong, it's how we make sense of things. And what we seem to see reflected in the biblical text of how people made sense of things seems to fit with how people made sense of things in those time periods. So those are kind of pieces of the puzzle, if you like. They don't prove necessarily anything, but they give us a sense of the authenticity, of the stories that the texts tell. That makes sense. The Old Testament in general, these parts I would say, reflects the world that it exists in. It also at times challenges it. That's the other thing we've got to remember, that the Old Testament has an agenda, and so we would expect it at times to not reflect the world in which it exists, but actually to challenge it. Probably the creation stories, even though they're slightly outside what I'm talking about tonight, are a good example of that. You know, all the other creation stories we have from that part of the world in that period of history talk about many gods and the theogonies, so the genesis of those gods, where those gods came from. The Old Testament seems to be quite deliberately, explicitly rejecting that worldview. So, you know, I would say that's not because it doesn't reflect the time in which, you know, the thinking of the time, but actually because it's trying to challenge the thinking of the time. How are we doing for time? Okay, just keep moving along. So, getting into a few other issues, where are we? In terms of specifics, I guess, and this is the questions that I sometimes get asked, and I don't know if I have great answers, but specifics in terms of dating, when we're talking about, like I'm talking second millennium, that's fairly general. I'm talking ancient Near East, that's fairly broad category. So generally speaking, it seems to reflect authentically that period of history in that part of the world. Trying to get more specific and actually date things is certainly an exercise that lots of people have engaged in. Lots of biblical scholars have spilled a lot of ink and spent a lot of time trying to affix dates to the people in the Old Testament, the events of the Old Testament. Really easy, as I said before, up to a point, and then becomes really difficult. Again, I know some of you probably all over this stuff, others of you maybe not. So in terms of ancient record keeping, that's one thing, in terms of how they kept records, what they wrote about. You also have how they understood time and how they kept records of time. And I've just been thinking about this in preparation for tonight, and I've actually realised something for the first time. So most Old Testament scholars will talk about the difference between relative dating and absolute dating. Okay, it's a familiar concept to some of you, others don't know. Just introduce you to that. So relative dating is when you date an event in relation to something else. So if I said to you, I was born in the year that the Governor General sacked the Prime Minister. Some of you would be like, I know exactly how old you are, yes? Others of you might be like, I don't actually know what you're talking about. If I was dressing a room in the US or Indonesia, they'd go, that doesn't help you at all. Yeah? So that's relative date. I've given you one date in relation to another, and you have to be able to put those pieces together. Yeah? Absolute dating is if I say to you, I was born in 1975. And you will go, okay, we can do the maths. Yes? So we have what we call an absolute dating system, where I can tell you that today is the 9th of April. I thought it was the 8th earlier today, but it's the 9th of April, 2015. That's what we call an absolute date. There is no absolute dating system in the Old Testament, firstly for the obvious reason that nobody was counting down in BC. You know, this is so many years, you know. I know, I'm shocked you haven't known. But, you know, so there is no way of... So all dates in the ancient world, and certainly in the Old Testament, are relative. They're always going to be in terms of something else. One of the things that struck me for the first time in preparing for this might sound really obvious, I just never thought about it in these terms, is we actually have a relative dating system as well. Because it's not an absolute date to say it's the 9th of April 2015. That's relative to an event that we kind of think took place around about 2015 years ago that we've decided to set our calendars by. We've said it's April because we set up this system. So it's actually all relative, and it's really interesting the way we frame this discussion, almost as if us modern, smart, wise people do this absolute thing that's very scientific, and those ancient people did this kind of really weird, you know, unhelpful relative thing. Well, so arrogant of us. Anyway, so two different types of dating though. So we have a system where we kind of put onto history. Our relative dating system is what I'm now going to call it, but what we call absolute dating, and when we say this took place in the 15th century BC, we put that dating system onto it, and then we try and affix the events that we read about to the dates that we have assigned to them. It's quite a tricky thing to do. As I said, it's interestingly kind of an arrogant thing to do, but I guess it's what we have to do it all from our perspective. So a couple of ways that we can do that. There are things that we can fix in the Old Testament, and if you study the Old Testament, there comes a point, it's around about the division of the kingdom after the death of Solomon, where you will read books telling you the year and even the month and even the day on which events occurred. So 931 BC was the division of the kingdom after Solomon died. Like, we've got that one pinned down. Well, how do we do that? Again, smarter people than me, who take what we know of Old Testament history, what we know of Assyrian and Babylonian history. So we have other histories where they recorded events. We can line those events up, you know, match them up with the two different dating systems. And then what they used in those history of astronomical events. So when some of their dates are linked to astronomical events, so eclipses and movement of planets and the sun, and again, people who are way smarter than me can sit down and figure out when that happened on our dating system and work it out. So there comes a point in Old Testament history when we can be quite certain, and there's kind of quite a level of agreement about when things took place and how they fit into the wider history of the world as we are aware of it and as we put our perspective on dating it. So yeah, some really clear examples of intersections between them. However, prior to 931 BC, it's much harder because we just don't have those kind of synchronic records, so where we have two groups of people keeping different records and different dating systems that we can apply, and we don't have people dating things by reference to astronomical events that we can date. And you get events in the Old Testament where, is it Joel who says, this happened 2 years after the earthquake? Well, that's really helpful. Which earthquake? When did the earthquake happen? No, it doesn't help us affix a date to it at all. So certainly prior to, and this is why we have this kind of division almost, if you like, from David backwards, where it's much more difficult due to the lack of a dating system from our point of view that works for us. Also the lack of writing and record keeping from the period. So it's going to be based much more on the interpretation of archaeological findings, so you're going to get much more debate. Yeah, because that's the way it goes. I would say a couple of other factors in that. The issue of writing is another one. So the further back you go into the Old Testament, the further you get to points where events were not written down as they happened. So the writings we have are not contemporaneous with the events that took place, because writing develops over time, preservation of writing develops over time, So you're talking about kind of those issues of the oral telling of and then writing as the nature of the text that we kind of have to accept. So I come to a point where, I'm fairly comfortable being able to say I don't think I will ever be able to pin down the date of the Exodus. And this is one of the biggest debates in Old Testament historicity, is when did the Exodus happen? Tremper Longman, who is an Old Testament scholar, he's written a couple of books on this kind of stuff and kind of fairly prominent in evangelical circles on this kind of stuff. He did a public lecture a few years ago that I went to in Sydney, and he basically got up this night like this, and he said, well, there are two possibilities. Like, everybody agrees there are two possibilities for the date of the Exodus, 13th century, 15th century BC. So these are the only two possibilities. Here's all the reasons why it cannot possibly be the 15th century, and here's all the reasons why it cannot possibly be the 13th century, but here's all the reasons why it has to be one of those two. Okay, right. If my faith in the Exodus depends on knowing when it happened, I'm in trouble. Yes? If the nature of the text is that we have to prove this is when this happened, this is who the Pharaoh was, this is the details, that's where truth in the text resides, then we have a problem. There are really good reasons for and against both those dates. I'm looking at the evidence, I can tell you I come down on one side over the other because it seems to me more likely, but I'm not staking anything on it because it just is beyond my ability to fix in terms of my frame of reference, which is our so-called absolute dating system, and the way the ancient text works and the nature of the ancient text. So there's an ongoing debate whether archaeology will ever resolve it or not. I can't tell you. Maybe a side issue, but for me, the best evidence of the historicity of the Exodus, despite all the books that have been written and all the ink has been spilled over proving which date it happened on, for me the best evidence of the historicity of the Exodus is that you have generations of people who lived their lives in response to that happening in their history, and it's very difficult to look at any culture in the world today and kind of have their fundamental story and say, oh, that didn't happen. So, in a sense, it's maybe not quite the same, it's certainly not as significant, but, the best evidence for the arrival of the first fleet in Sydney Cove in 1788 is not actually proving the date that the boats landed. It's the fact that we have a nation that has this as its story. This is what happened, this is what we did, and 200 years later, that's the story we tell. Does that make sense? So for me, maybe that's not a classical historicity answer, but for me that's actually a better answer. And maybe that's more a sociological answer, that the shaping of people and communities and nations for generations is very difficult to explain without a historical foundation. So yeah, as I said, sometimes my students get frustrated. maybe you do too, but for me that's the shift in the debate I want to have. Let's not spend all our time debating whether it was 15th century or 13th century, who the pharaoh was, which city they were building. Let's say this is the origin story of this nation and they have lived out of it. They still, the Jews still live out of that story to this day. It has persisted so pervasive for so long. That is really, really good evidence of its historicity. I'm trying to think where I'm up to in terms of just to have, look, I've missed them. So let's have a pause and look at some photos. So this is one of the other creation and flood stories, just in terms of looking at these other ancient documents we have. I should make the same point about them that I did about archaeology. Obviously they need to be, that's a piece of evidence, it needs to be translated, interpreted, extrapolated from. It's not just a pristine, existing, unbiased thing, but that's that one. But this is the one I want to show you. This is what they call the synchronistic history. This is in the British Museum. So this is a history that deals with relations between Assyria and Babylonia from 14th to 8th century BC. I love this. It's particularly concerned with disputes between the borders, because nothing's changed. That's what people fight over. We're not really interested in their little border disputes from 3,000 years ago. But fortuitously for us, providentially for us, the fact that these two nations have kind of given an account of their interactions with each other, and so, what was happening at different points in their history, provides one of the basic foundations that people use to then go back and try and date the stories of the Old Testament. I think that's a pretty cool piece of stone. That was, in terms of, this is later than David, but in terms of fixing against specifically, if you want to get to how Israel fits into it, this is a Shalmaneser's obelisk. Been to the British Museum? This is in the British Museum. It's taller than me. This is, again, the story, now I'm going, it's Assyrian. Shalmaneser, yes. There are camels. There are camels, you're right. Were they domesticated though? That's awesome. They are, so I think they are domesticated, yes. But this is 9th century, so that doesn't necessarily prove anybody's argument either way. But yeah, this is the records of Shalmaneser, the Assyrian king. But on there, again, if you could learn how to read these kind of ancient texts on stone and interpret them, you would be able to see that there is a picture of kings submitting to him here, bringing tributes to him, and that one of these kings bringing tribute to him is Jehu, the king of Israel. So we have biblical history, we have Assyrian history, we have Assyrian and Babylonian synchronistic history. We can put the pieces together and come up with a sense of the historicity of the Old Testament to a point. Okay, yes, that's what I wanted to get on. Two more things I want to talk about before we have a break quickly. Archaeology, that's a nice little small topic. I'm not an archaeologist and I'm never going to be. I went to Israel the first time I went, my lecturer did some study there, was an archaeologist, and he took us to the site that he worked on for 10 years of his life where they found nothing of significance. And I thought, I'm never going to be an archaeologist, And you have other people that, go on a dig for 2 weeks and find something amazing. But yeah, 10 years, a place called Beit Shan, and they found nothing of any significance to anyone. But archaeology. So, it's a lovely place. Oh, look, I'd go hang out there, but I don't want to spend my time digging up rocks. But if you're into that, good on you. We need people who do it. So a few comments on archaeology. I was going to say about absolutely the usefulness of archaeology. As I said at the beginning, I don't believe the role of archaeology is to prove or disprove the Bible. I just don't think that's how it works. I think that's how it's popularly presented, and like websites with shocking headlines, like I showed you at the beginning. But I think that's a fairly simplistic and naive view of archaeology. What I think archaeology can do, it can confirm the presentation of events in the Old Testament. So things like Shalmaneser's obelisk, where it mentions Jehu and him bringing a tribute, and we go, okay, that confirms to us the story we have in the text here. You could argue we've got 2 pieces of archaeological evidence that the text is, in one sense, we separate with this artificial distinction between the biblical text and other texts of the ancient Near East and call them archaeology and it the text. That's a whole other debate. To confirm the presentation of events in the Old Testament, it can give us background details. So it can tell us, about the culture and of the time and things that we didn't know about practices. It can give us insight into what the world of the text was like in a broader way. It can challenge our assumptions about the text. I think one of the best things for me as a Christian is when someone discovers something archaeologically and there's legitimacy to it rather than sensationalism, it may challenge what I think the text is saying it's a good chance for me to say, am I reading the text right? Not that I'm saying the archaeology is disproving it or anything like that, but I make assumptions all the time about the text as I'm reading it based on my perspective and my agenda and where I'm coming from. Maybe this actually is a chance for me to re-examine some of those assumptions, ask some questions of it, ask, is my interpretation of what I've extrapolated, is the Bible claiming what I think it's claiming? Because it may not be, that kind of thing. So I think archaeology is really helpful and really useful, and I have a great deal of respect for archaeologists, even though I just dissed them and said I don't want to be one. Personal experience for me, actually going to Israel and seeing some of these places really affirmed the reality of it for me, affirmed my sense of the historicity of the Old Testament. To stand in these places and to see what is there and to think, you know, I think the kind of these arguments, oh, it's all just a load of rubbish and it's all just made up, just don't stand up to the reality of the place. Sure, finer details is a different issue, but big picture, seeing the place for me affirms the reality of it. One of the places for me that was most significant, this is Tabor in the north of Israel. It's mentioned in the Bible once, really not a big deal. It's mentioned in Joshua, and it's called the head of the kingdoms in the book of Joshua. So when they came in and took the land, this was the head of the kingdoms, which from the text, you know, nobody really spent much time talking about Tabor because that's its only mention. They never capture it, you know, nothing ever happens there in the biblical stories. Who cares, so what? Then this site is discovered last century, and it's massive. It's actually the biggest Canaanite city that has been so far discovered in Israel. Maybe others, but so far of what we have found. You know, here is this massive city which has, you know, habitation. It has storage facilities for grain and silos. It has a huge temple. These massive, like huge pillars that were, you know, the foundation of this temple. I can't remember what animal they are, but, you know, animals carved out of stone at the entrance to the temple. I think they're lions, something like that. You know, just that sense of standing in this and going, you know, history is not conceptual and abstract and intellectual. We're talking about real people and real places. And so for me, geography has actually had a really big impact on my understanding of history and archaeology and bringing it together. I think, have I got one other? Oh, so that's the temple. The structure of the top is not ancient. There was a current dig happening when I was there, so that was protecting the work they were doing. But yeah, these two here, these are the pillars, the bases of these massive pillars. You can't really get a scale, I need a person standing there, but these are huge. And then this is the base of one of these animals. But this huge temple complex. And then, you know, that's what the site looks like because they've already done the work there. Then you go to the Israel Museum and they've reconstructed for you what they found. I can't leave it out in the open. But, you know, this is the worship they found in that temple, all these standing stones, which we read about in the Old Testament, this idea of worshipping, having standing stones that represent the gods that you worship. This kind of idea of just this idea of the picture the Old Testament paints of the kind of worship that was happening in the land, it rings true with, you know, it is confirmed by or, you know, given richness by what archaeologists have discovered. Yeah. The other place I have, maybe less, this is Jericho, sometimes called the most excavated city in the world because archaeologist after archaeologist after archaeologist has gone to Jericho and kind of tried to make their fame and fortune. I may be being too cynical and harsh here, but a little bit seems like, you know, this will be the place that we can prove, or this will be the place that we can disprove what the Bible says. The reality has been that neither has really happened. It's fairly inconclusive. What we do know is that there's a place called Jericho, that people have lived there for thousands of years and lots of stuff happened there, but I can't tell you what stuff happened on what date. You know, what date did the walls fall down? You can read the results of 4 different archaeologists who've worked on this over different periods of history, and 2 of whom will tell you they can date exactly what happened in the story of Joshua, and 2 of whom will tell you it never happened. And, you know, interpretation of the evidence is dependent on a whole lot of other factors outside of the actual evidence itself. But certainly just the sense of, you know, there are real, oh, that's a terrible photo of me, but there you go. Real places, getting a sense of history. And what I really appreciated and got to appreciate about archaeology, again, I need a person in this photo. If a person was in this photo, they'd probably be about that high. So this is layer upon layer upon layer of history. What you have there is up to 25 layers of different periods of history of people who've lived in this place. Now that tells me not much, you know, that my interpretation of that is they built walls. But in terms of the sense of history being about, the lives of people over time, for me that was a significant place. Okay, totally running out of time. So, a couple more things. Oh, I have got a few more things. Hopefully, give me a few more. If you keep going, go nuts. I'm trying to give plenty of time for questions, but I don't know if I'll be able to answer them anyway. So, so as a personal experience, seeing the places affirmed the reality for me. The limitation of archaeology. So really useful, really helpful. Limitation of archaeology, as I said, it needs to be interpreted, and it is not unbiased. A stone cannot speak. Somebody has to tell you what that stone means, and that somebody comes with their own perspective. Whether they acknowledge it or not, they come with some kind of bias. They can try their best not to, and that's great. But there's going to be some interpretation, and then, as I said before, extrapolation from that interpretation that can't necessarily do the job that I think popular imagination suggests that archaeology can do. What I did want to tell you about, just to try and give you some positive things maybe, and I guess for some of you really interested in this, others might just want a couple of little quick things. I guess a couple of significant archaeological discoveries that I would say have been really significant for the earlier parts of the Old Testament. So things that have confirmed for us that do give some foundation and confirmation to the historicity of the Old Testament. So just running through about 4 of these. You might have heard of some of these. First one is what we call the Mereneptah Stela. Mereneptah was a pharaoh of Egypt in the 13th century BC, buried like all pharaohs of the time in the Valley of the Kings, which is where I am in this photo. Unfortunately, I'm not allowed to take photos underground, but this is where all the tombs are underground. This is where Tutankhamun's tomb is, kind of stuff. So, Valley of the Kings, you had these tombs of the pharaohs, and the pharaohs were buried with all their stuff. And I mean all their stuff, including their servants. You don't be servant pharaoh, yeah. So, gold and paintings and history, and stories and, stones that they had, monuments that they had erected to themselves. So this is a map of the Valley of the Kings. So all of these little black dots are different tombs of different pharaohs, and these are the ones we've discovered. Whether there are more, we probably not, but Tutankhamun's was a surprise discovery. And this, because I can't show you a photo, but this is a diagram of Mereneptah's burial chamber. And if you can have a look here, that's a flight of stairs, right? That's a flight of 10 stairs. So hopefully that gives you some sense of the scale of this thing. It's massive, it's huge. Apparently they started building them when the guy became pharaoh, and so the longer you lived, the more impressive your tomb became, which is why Tutankhamun's was so small and they found it so, because he was young, didn't expect him to die. So this is Mereneptah's tomb, all the way down, paintings, monuments, gold, silver, everything you can think of that he was buried with, which is all lovely and fascinating, and go to the Cairo Museum and you can see it all, and it's really interesting for Egyptian history. For Old Testament history, probably one of the most significant discoveries was this stone that was discovered there, which we call the Mereneptah Stela. It's basically his boasting stone, to use my slang term, an account of all the wonderful things that he did during his reign. This stone, in terms of size, I found this myself. I asked a guide and I didn't know where it was. I'm walking around the Cairo Museum going, can't leave without seeing, and I spotted it because it's about this tall. It's much bigger than I expected it to be. All this hieroglyphics, all this writing on it, and then right about here, right-hand side, you can't really see in this photo, but on the real thing you can tell because it's been touched by so many hands, is the earliest mention in archaeological evidence of Israel outside the Bible. So Mereneptah, Pharaoh, boasting of all the things that he has done, and he mentions Israel. So that was a pretty exciting discovery at the time, certainly gives confirmation, doesn't necessarily prove anything, but gives confirmation to the fact that there was a people known as Israel who the Egyptians were aware of, back in the 12th century, 1200s. So 1200s is 13th century, yes, thank you. Working backwards, get myself confused. BC, yes, so in the 13th century or 1200s BC. So earliest mention of Israel outside the Bible, quite significant in terms of confirming that. Next one, the Amarna letters. Don't have to tell you about them because you can read if you want, but this is from the British Museum. So found in the ruins of Pharaoh Akhenaten's capital. These are clay tablets written in Babylonian cuneiform, basically correspondence between the pharaohs of Egypt and some of their vassal princes. That basically means the people that they'd conquered who were now subject to them. So they're writing letters back and forth between them. And the Amarna letters opposite to the Melinda stela, are much smaller than you might expect. They're tiny little things, tiny little pieces of stone with this, writing engraved on them. And all kinds of things, and again, the interpretation of these, you can read books and books and books on exactly what these mean and what they do and don't prove. But again, in terms of what they can shed light on or add confirmation or evidence to, the general picture they present. So there are letters from the region of Palestine or Canaan, the region that the Israelites went into around about this time, probably a little bit after these letters were written, but depending on who you ask. They confirm that picture of that it was a land of city-states. So when the Israelites go in and they kind of have to conquer one city and then the other and then the other, and you're like, what's going on? Because each city is has its own king. It's a separate entity, a separate state. That picture of what life was like, certainly confirmed by these, because you have all these different princes or kings writing back to the pharaohs. And then there is this group mentioned in the Amarna letters. There's a group of people, it's back on the interpretation there. The Amarna's letters make reference to the Haparu or Aparu, depending how you translate it, depicted as a roving band of stateless people based in the hill country conducting raids on cities. There is a huge debate over the relationship between the Aparu and the Hebrews, but certainly suggestive. Certainly gives some sense of the kind of events that the Old Testament talks about happening in records from another part of the world. Two more I think I've got. This is the Karnak temple. This is a little bit later, but still within the kind of period, just toward the very end of that 9th century period where we find it hard to date things. Karnak temple is in Egypt as well, at Karnak. More photos than I expected. But what we're interested in is this kind of inscription on the wall. It's not in the main part of the temple, it's actually on the outside. I asked my guide to take me around to the edge to go and find it. But it's an inscription by a pharaoh by the name of Shoshenq. Now here's my rudimentary understanding of hieroglyphics for you. This is Shoshenq. See, he's the big tall guy. I'm so good. This is his story. And like most records of kings from the ancient world, it has an agenda. It's basically a piece of propaganda saying, let me tell you how good I am. I'm this big because I did all these cool things, yes? So pretty much this is a list of his achievements. And if you're talking achievements in the ancient world, you're basically talking all the people that he conquered. Yes? This is his taking over the world. And so you have inscribed on this these lists, and these are the lists of all the cities and the people groups that he conquered. And so each one of these, if you know anything about Egyptian hieroglyphics, there's a person here, and then there's what we call cartouche, which is a name, which is how the Egyptians write the name of someone in that sort of shape. If you can see the people there, they look like they've only got one arm. That's actually because they've got their arms tied behind their back to represent that they are slaves. They are, have been conquered. They are in chains. And then each one of these, if you can translate hieroglyphics, which I can't, so I trust the people who've done it for me. Thank goodness there are linguists who do that. Names all these different cities that he conquered. And included on this list, you have cities like Jerusalem and Lachish and, I'm trying to think, I don't think Jericho's on there. Maresha, Beit Shemesh, I think. A lot of places in Israel. And this story of Pharaoh Shoshenq in the Bible, his name is translated as Shishak. You can read it in 1 Kings 14. So it's the biblical portrayal of this Pharaoh who comes in and he robs the temple, and here we have his account of it. What I find interesting about this is the accounts don't perfectly line up, because pretty much he claims Jerusalem as a place that he conquered. Biblical story says he came in and took our gold from the temple. Quite the same story, but I'm comfortable with that because that's how ancient documents work. Of course he's not going to say, well, this one I kind of half got them, so I'll just draw it. This is his claim to. So generally speaking, it's a pretty good indication of the other side of the story. Last one, this is my favourite. This is a place called Tel Dan, also up in the north, not far from Hatzor. Tel Dan is a city from 9th, 10th century Israel. 8th century Israel. So we're actually talking a city that's after the time of David. That's in the time of the kings, after Solomon, and we're talking later than that. But what was discovered here is fascinating. So this is as you're walking to the entrance of the city, you've got a little city idol here, and the gates, what's it called? Altar, worship set up with some stones. Indicates the people living here were worshipping a number of gods, so probably not the best Israelites ever. But and that's their history. But this is, I was taken here by one of the archaeologists who worked on it, so this is the story as he tells it and as I tell it. So when they were excavating this, basically what you have here in these stones is the remains of some kind of structure, of some kind of probably room or of a house, where people lived in the city, probably in the city gates. So you're talking about a guard or someone who dwells within one of those rooms in the city gates. So a guard person who sleeps there to protect the city. And the walls of this are made with these random stones, all different shapes and sizes. It's quite an interesting structure in terms of how it's been made. Basically what it seems to have happened, they've just collected stones from everywhere, shoved them together, maybe built it in a hurry, we don't really know, we're interpreting the evidence. But these stones are being reused, they're just grabbing them from elsewhere. And so in this random wall of this random guard tower in this random town in Israel, probably one of the most significant archaeological discoveries for the Old Testament was discovered. Because two of the pieces of stone that were used to build this wall had been previously used for a different purpose and had been repurposed by the builder of this wall for something else. And so in 1993, so we're talking 20 years ago, this two pieces of stone, or this sort of, I don't actually know if it's totally separate or whether they're joined, but this stone was discovered. It's called the Tel Dan Stela. So this is a really recent discovery, and it was found in the most kind of random place. It is the only mention of David outside the Bible. So I have textbooks on my shelf that will tell you there is no evidence that David ever existed. He's just a made-up figure in the Bible. This is one of those times where you go, wow, that's really interesting. Again, does this prove the existence of David? Well, it's not a photo, but it certainly confirms the biblical story, which is evidence in and of itself. And so it was a pretty important discovery, and it's got its own section in the Israel Museum, and it's fairly highlighted because it's a pretty big deal. So, anything about. So this is the translation of it. It's not actually talking about David himself, it's talking about a king of the house of David. So what this is the stela that's been erected by someone coming from outside. At some point in the history of this city, a king from outside has come and conquered it. And what you do when you conquer a city is you erect a little stone monument to yourself saying, I'm so good. And on this statement saying how good he is, he has said, I conquered this king of the house of David. So at that point in time, this king was known as one of those who was of the line of David. The name of David was known. So, kind of interesting. Okay, I'll just wrap it up. The last thing I wanted to talk about was just, I guess, the big picture for me about assumptions about history and the role of faith. I guess probably got this message all the way through, but to go back to what I said at the beginning, I think there is no such thing as pure history, and I think trying to argue on a kind of scientific history basis is maybe an interesting intellectual exercise, but I don't think it's ever going to convince anyone, and I'm not sure that it's the best way of dealing with the biblical text. So I think we want to have a robust understanding of, the grounding of the Old Testament in history, of the sense that it fits the time period within it took place, that we can have confidence in the big picture of the world it describes and the key events that shaped the life of the nation. I'm not sure that we need to push into sort of staking our reputation on the dates or specific details of every part, of every story. That's just my personal opinion. I'm just not sure that that's the best use of time in terms of the text. Because what I would say is that someone who has, now this is where I go, I know at least one historian in the room who knows way more about this than me, but someone who has an understanding of history that is my understanding, fairly common modernist view of history, starts from some fairly blatant assumptions, while they may not be stated. But the general assumptions about scientific history are basically, assessing the probability of events and making a judgment on the probability of those events by analogy, which is how, what is my experience of the world and what do I know of what's possible, and therefore does this seem probable in light of my experience and my knowledge? And then what they call correlation, this idea that history is a unified web of cause and effect. That's all a bit of a, real summary of an article written by a guy in 1898. But in other words, there is an underlying assumption of history, certainly in critical circles which are very critical and not, I don't mean that in a good way, of biblical history, that everything is explainable by reference to our own experience and reference correlation and analogy to our view and understanding of history. In practice, I think what that means is you're basically saying there is no possibility of anything that is outside the realm of my experience, i.e. history, by definition, on this definition of history, discounts the possibility of a transcendent cause. And if that's your starting point, if you do not believe that there is the possibility of something that is supernatural or transcendent or outside analogy to the cause and effect experience of history that you have set up as a framework for yourself, then nothing I say is ever going to convince you of that, because your starting assumption is, this text that we have is not historical because it doesn't, by definition, meet the criteria for what history is. And so you're kind of at this fundamental, we're not talking the same language. For me, as a Christian, my experience and my faith is based on evidence of what God has done in my life, and that is miraculous, that there is, and it is based on this miraculous event called the resurrection. And once I accept that possibility that there is a God who is transcendent, who has done a work in my life that is beyond cause and effect and correlation and analogy to anyone else in history, and the resurrection is beyond those things, then that kind of opens a door for me that changes, the fundamental starting point. So I guess I just wanted to end with that. I think in the end, it is an issue of faith. And I said, I love that, the name, never been here before, but reasonable faith. It's faith that is founded on, the ability to say, look, there is consistency here, there is authenticity, there is a sense in which we can point to some things that give us really good basis for the interpretations that we make about history. But in the end, it's faith that comes from trusting the God who I have met, who has done the miraculous in my life, and who I believe has done the miraculous in raising Jesus from the dead, and therefore allows me to be open to the miraculous within history. And I can't, can't say more than that. So sorry for taking a bit more time than I planned to. I hope that has been somewhat interesting.
I think you're selling yourself short. That's really awesome. So we're going to have a break, probably for about, 10 minutes, just to catch some refreshments, and then we'll come back for any questions, insights, and just keep the conversation going. Okay, well, thank you again, Melinda. We've just got about 20 or so minutes just for some questions and comments. Just one that immediately came to mind for me. I really appreciated your comment about people who are living out the evidence of that, and particularly using the Australian one. I was thinking how, we haven't, part of the other thing about that is our national identity is actually built onto narratives that don't make us look particularly good, like namely the First Fleet and Gallipoli, and the fact that we've made those our predominant historical narratives when they're actually kind of inconvenient to us is kind of interesting. We can put a positive spin on them, but and that's actually quite analogous to the Israelites. Like they choose as their national identity a story where they pretty much suck. God doesn't suck, but if you were going to make up your own national identity, you wouldn't make it about, we were slaves and we did nothing to stop our things, and when we got out, the God that had rescued us, we pretty much treated like a jerk. I thought that was a really good point. Did anyone else have any questions or comments or things that they just wanted to bring into the conversation?
I think the way we understand inspiration of Scripture is going to affect the way we'll try and defend Scripture.
Could you...
if we understand sort of inerrant, God inspired Genesis and the Old Testament as a fair and accurate representation of what happens in the way that someone today might write a book.
Or a newspaper or something like that.
Then we're going to look at history or archaeology and hope to find things that match very exactly. Whereas if we're if we're happy to say inspiration just means that God let it end up as something that was going to be helpful for us, even though there was oral retellings and things were written down that wouldn't necessarily get 10 out of 10 according to modern journalism standards. And then
I was being facetious about that, but never mind. Here we go.
Then we're not going to try and defend it and try and prove that there had to be that many people in the Exodus and all those details.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, Melinda?
Yeah, something I'm trying to recall it because I was just reading something today that I hadn't come across before, a similar idea. I was talking about revelation, like how we understand revelation and the Bible as revelation. And yeah, this idea that if revelation of God is kind of contained in these words and it's the inerrancy of the words themselves, but that has actually a limited view of God, rather than that God chose to use kind of imperfect human means to express a text that reveals the God who is revealing himself even now through that text. And I mean, this is much more kind of my area, but that idea that the text is God revealing himself now as well as then. So it makes, I think you're like, I totally agree with you. I think it kind of makes the text almost a historical artifact that God revealed himself through then in a way that is only limited and bound to back then, and therefore if there is anything in that that's sort of not provable and verifiable and exactly to the dotted I and cross T, then we have a problem. But that to me is actually the assumptions behind that may be actually some assumptions about God that are limiting. I don't know if that makes sense, but it's good.
Yep.
I was interested in your saying about the God
Delusion.
or whatever it is, delusion from Richard Dawkins, and how God didn't satisfy what you feel he should have said. When I was reading that, he talked about Abraham. Was it Abraham? Who gave his wife to Pharaoh, saying it's his sister, and why they did this. And an interpretation of that I found interesting was that in the ancient times, the gods were the leading founders of nations, of Egypt, Greece, and whatever. And the Jews had only one God, and they were determined that there will be no other gods. And so they took their founding fathers, and when they wrote him up, they gave him his human failings, so that he could never become a god.
Okay.
I thought that was an interesting.
Yeah, it is. I mean, I would say for me that is one of those examples where I was talking about the Bible, or the Old Testament, kind of reflects its time period and yet challenges it. Because I think you're right. Most other ancient Near Eastern writings are propaganda in the sense of, let me tell you how good the ancestors and the gods and the kings, and it's all very much propaganda in that sense of putting themselves in a good light. And almost like Israel's picking up on your point as well, deliberately tried to tell their story. I still think it has an agenda, but it's a different agenda. The agenda is God, not
Like you, I wanted to tell Richard about it.
I do. I should say, I don't know if I was picking on him because I mean there are better, arguments against the Old Testament made by others, and he's maybe an easy cheap shot to argue against. But
sorry, Melinda, just going back a little bit before Genesis chapter 12, because I do believe there is some of the instruction before that.
Yes.
Am I right to say that Sumerian king list, obviously circa 2000, is a list of names? You can argue about the dates of how long they're, but at least, according to Wikipedia, the great lump of all truth, the names of the king's list actually do correlate very strongly right back to Genesis chapter 4.
no, I thought it was Genesis chapter 10. Is that what you're talking about?
No, Genesis chapter 4. The
Okay,
names of the early names of
I'm not familiar with it. I know there is an ancient king list,
It might
which
not
is
be,
in
it
British
may not
Museum.
have been the king list, and it was some
Okay.
other record that,
Right.
according to Wikipedia, and apparently a professor,
I got it from somewhere.
who claims that
Yeah, no,
there's a close correlation, and that there's Besorus, the Babylonian historian equivalent to
Right.
the Greek.
Okay, no, I'm sorry, I'm not familiar with that. I can say the Babylonian king, I think it's Babylonian king list. I have to look it up. I've got a photo of it on my computer. And Genesis 10, there is certainly some sense of similar structure and style in terms of, like if you read the king list in Genesis 10, like it's mostly
big picture, and then it'll give these random obscure details. If that makes sense, you know. So, and that style, that idea of mostly big picture and then these weird little details. That's my understanding, that there's kind of this reflection of the similar style or way of presenting history.
I've got Matt's email address. Look, if I can dig up this quote, and I don't know, it's up to you whether you want to but
Sure.
you know, I found that very interesting to say, even as far as Genesis chapter 4, there's at least one other source in history that has a set of names that match quite close correlation with those we find in Genesis chapter 4 for the Canaan's, Canaan's descendants.
I guess that's another example of that point that you were making about a cultural resonance, I guess. That
why didn't I have that word?
Yeah, I know. So a cultural resonance, that they use that kind of genre, if you like, and you know, here we have another example of that genre that correlates.
I think your fluoro socks got the drift of
Yeah, totally.
You knew about mine, don't you?
Yeah, I was there. Mine odd. Now I'm
Used to wear one pink and one yellow.
Yeah, see?
Did you have fluoro socks, Matt?
Yeah, totally.
Yeah.
Sorry for all those words.
But that really shows the proof is in the pudding, because like as soon as you say that, I go, oh well, then it's not like you're making up, like you're actually, you know, born in the 90s or something. Yeah. I know the only person who would really know that, and again inconvenient, you know, would admit to that is someone from that era, you know. So okay, anyone else? Yep.
Thank you very much for that. It's much appreciated. I guess I'm interested in the knockdowns. Like, I work in a very secular culture, so I'm interested in what are the stumbling blocks for people. So, what's the biggest challenge, and what's the you've had from your studies in the history, archaeologically, and what's the biggest aha moment, or what's the biggest thing you've had both ways?
I was thinking that in the breakaway, I gave you kind of the highlights of, you know, the like 4 archaeological discoveries, the real wow ones. It's like, what are the really challenging ones? I mean, I'm trying to think. It's a really good question. I don't know, but it's linked to history. I mean, for me personally, I think one of the stumbling blocks is the genocide, you know, the Canaanite genocide, for want of a better description. That's what people call it, and that's what they say to me. And I, you know, trying to, you know, historically, I can argue that there's some cultural resonance, to use Matt's term there, that practice was widespread, that it wouldn't have been seen as a problem back then. But I still, you know, find that a really difficult.
No, I don't think you chat, but I mean from the history.
No, what I'm saying is it's kind of a history, but that's a good question. Is this true? Is it not? I mean, I think I'm pretty comfortable with the big picture. It's really. It sounds terrible to say I can't think of one, and I should have thought of one beforehand. But it's usually the details that I feel like I come to a point of saying, I don't think the text is claiming what I've been told it's claiming. So I'm not sure if there's anything, and if you know of something, feel free to tell me, because I can't think of anything off the top of my head that I think, that's a real stumbling block to the history of the Old Testament, and it's a historical element to the Old Testament story that I believe is essential to the foundation of the story, if that makes sense. So, you know, as I said, things like the camels, you know, I mean, there are anachronisms in the Old Testament text. There are details that are written later, you know, names that have been changed, like, you know, the Chaldeans are mentioned back in Genesis. You know, that's been written back, like someone's changed it later from Babylon, or whatever it is, from whatever it was to whatever it was. And I'm okay with that because of my understanding of the nature of the text and when it was written. So I can't think of an example.
Ramses is probably another example of that. So like in the Exodus accounts and other places like that, it says, and one of the towns they built was Ramses.
Yeah.
And people go, aha, well Ramses wasn't even the name of that town, and Ramses wasn't even around at that point. But it could well be that all they're doing is saying, well, the town that they now call Ramses, right, they built that, you know, or that kind of thing. It's the same as if someone said something like, the town of Istanbul has been around for ages, and someone said, aha, well, back then they didn't even call it Istanbul, they called it Constantinople. You go, good for you.
Yeah, exactly.
But I guess back to the thing of those kind of stumbling blocks, at a large proportion of the time you end up really going, big deal. If that's what you're resting your argument on.
You know, something, so talking from Abraham to David, you know, for me the big ticket items are that there was, you know, and Abraham, there was a family who had an experience of God that caused them to leave their home and, you know, transform their lives. that there was, well, an entrance into Egypt, there was an exodus from Egypt, you know, there was a coming into the land, you know, the kind of the big picture of the story. I don't think there's anything that I would not be comfortable with the evidence of saying is founded in history. It's the details, I think, some of the details.
So, one of the things I can't repair, but I was listening to a Veritas forum a while ago, and there's a discussion, and there was a claim that there was no evidence, archaeological evidence for the building of the pyramids by the Israelites.
Oh, absolutely would agree with that.
And does that trouble you? If it doesn't, why not?
Well, I mean, the pyramids are 1,000 years older than the Israelites being in Egypt, would be my understanding of the dating of it. So the pyramids were there well before the Israelites got there. In terms of the Exodus, I was talking about this a break, and the people would say there's no archaeological evidence for the Exodus. I'd say, again, this comes down to debate about evidence and interpretation. There are pieces of evidence that some people would interpret as confirming or adding some sense of authenticity to the Exodus, and other people would dispute and say do not add authenticity, you know, like, so to say there's no evidence is kind of like, what does that actually mean? There are pieces of archaeological evidence that some people interpret as adding authenticity to the historicity of the Exodus, depending on when you date the Exodus, of course, and other people dispute that. So that's, you know, that's, but for me, as I said, for me the best argument of the Exodus is that the nation lives out of this story and tells it, and so it doesn't bother me that there's no.
Just
why,
on that.
Why doesn't it?
Why doesn't it bother you? It sounds, and that's hard.
That's a
And that's a hard one to defend to somebody who is bothered by it.
Yeah,
how
that's
do you
true.
defend that to somebody who?
Yeah.
Just quickly while you're thinking, the two things about that. One is, like, the Bible, there's part of this is that there's an assumption that what the Bible actually says about something. So, for example, the pyramids one, there's an assumption being laid on there that the Bible actually talks about the Israelites building the pyramids. When you look at the text, it doesn't actually say that at all. It's like people who say things, to use a New Testament example, like, hey, do you realise that there's no evidence for 3 wise men? Therefore, the Bible, you know, Matthew 2 falls down. Well, Matthew 2 doesn't actually mention that there's 3 of them, or that they're men. And so, you know, so just part of it is where we've put cultural layers on top of the biblical story, and those cultural layers end up not being the case. Well, that doesn't negate what the actual Bible's saying. That's the first one.
But
It matches what would our expectations be, though, from the rest of the field? Isn't this an area where the expectations don't match what we would have expected to find? In that area, you wouldn't expect to find the life of Melissa and the 3 kings and their bibliography. Wouldn't you expect to find something from the Exodus?
See, that's the other thing. This comes back to that. I had another point, and that was Melinda made the point that all of these things come with bias. And so the majority of the texts that we have by the Egyptians are the ones that she should, you know, the kind of ones that she showed us tonight, the aren't I awesome? No one's going to write an aren't I awesome, I just lost an entire nation of slaves because their God beat me. You know, so this is important to recognise that they have their own bias in their own writings. So, you know, there's that element to that as well. But sorry,
you know, I'm probably going to say the same thing. I'm not sure that I would expect to find any textual evidence of the Exodus from Egypt for those reasons. The evidence of the Exodus is usually about the evidence of the conquest. Like, archaeologically speaking, there isn't, even like the debate over the Exodus, most of the evidence or pieces of evidence are actually about when Israel came into the land and therefore extrapolating back to when they came out of Egypt. And as I said, I'm not an expert on this, but it seems to be a field that's notoriously difficult. Like, you did 2 people, legitimate scholars who are trying to interpret the evidence unbiased, who look at exactly the same piece of evidence and come to totally opposite conclusions, which I guess leads me to that point of, I was saying this in the break, not in the session, archaeology is not the answer. It's not the panacea of, you know, that it's sometimes presented in the popular media to be. The point I was making to someone in the break, like, biblical studies is actually an older discipline than archaeology is. And so archaeology is still learning what it is, and so my suggestion would be that in 100 years' time, archaeologists will be looking back at the conclusions that archaeologists today are making and going, gee, we didn't know anything. Like archaeology, and it's probably the same for most disciplines, we're always learning and growing. But I think the popular imagination of archaeology, it sometimes gets held up as this kind of unbiased holy grail that, that solves everything, and it's not. It really depends on interpretation of really minimal evidence. You talk about these ground surveys that they've done about whether it was inhabited or not, and the techniques they use. Like, people can't even agree on whether the techniques work or not, let alone what they mean. And unless, and I get that for some people this is an issue, and for me it isn't something. But I guess personally, I go, unless I'm prepared to devote the next 40 years of my life to becoming an expert in that, I'm never going to be able to figure it out for myself. Like, I'm never personally going to be able to come to an intellectual, scholarly conclusion on the results of that ground survey and what they mean. I can't. I haven't got the time or the inclination to figure that out. So then I live with that.
And this ends up being that, because there are scholars who do actually end up saying, like archaeologists and stuff, who do actually end up saying, don't worry, it's fine. Even as there's ones that say, don't worry, actually worry, there's a real problem here. Yeah. And the thing is, because neither of them are definitive either way, you end up going, well, it's okay for me to end up going with this position as well. Yeah. Okay, anyone else have? Yep.
I think it's Orson Welles who gave us the idea that the pyramids were built by the thingy box.
It's in the
one of his movements. And as I say, it's not in the Bible at all. And they've also found the workers who worked on the pyramid nowadays, and they found that they were looked after very well. They weren't slaves at all. And they had the Pharaoh's own physician fix them up in the bust of the leg or something. But what I was going to say is, with the dating of when the Exodus started, I understand there is in the Old Testament itself, it talks about the time between the Exodus and the building of the temple or something or other. And the ancient Hebrews had some idea about when that was built. Our crowd reckon they know better and have nailed it right down on that. So if you take that back 500 or 500 something years, that gets you to the 15th or the 14th century.
It gets you to the early date Exodus.
Yes, but then, so that's one of the reasons for that.
Yes.
But then they say that there was no such things as Ramses at that stage. He came much later. And so you have that city of Ramses, and it says that, my understanding, the Bible says that the Hebrews were actually working on it, or that other funny name for it. And that city, they can date that, they reckon anyway, because although it's no longer in that position, they found the remains of about 20 miles away because the river dried up. Right. The tributary of the river dried up, and they took the stuff and built it somewhere else. But when it dried up, there's little bugs in there that died, and they can use carbon dating on that. And that brings it back into the 13th century.
I think the Exodus is a good example of kind of living with the tension. Even the biblical text. So the Septuagint has a difference in Exodus 12, I think it says 40, don't quote me on that, somewhere around there. But in the number is actually different in the Hebrew Masoretic text and in the Septuagint. So it's kind of one tends to suggest more the early date Exodus, one the late. And then obviously you have got the whole issue, which we didn't even talk about, of how numbers are used in the Old Testament text. Personally, I wouldn't go so far as to argue, they're just purely symbolic, but I certainly wouldn't want to argue that they counted and, kept records in the way that we do. The idea that someone in ancient times would be walking around saying, I am, 27 years and 6 months old. They're just the kind of the conceptual understanding of time, I think, is quite different. So you've got to give, credence to the Old Testament and the other ancient documents being a document of its time that is not going to use numbers and dates in the way that we use them. That's an unfair expectation to place in the text.
I think this comes to another thing. Like, historians talk about what's called anachronism. An anachronism is where you place your expectations and standards upon a culture or a text that, that's just not the culture of the time. And, so historians really lament when, you might see someone, when you see a particular story in say, 16th century England or something, and you say, oh, then everyone thought that was really bad when you did that. Well, you don't know their culture, and their culture, actually it turns out that they thought that was a great thing to do, you know. So part of it is the incorrect, you know, process of thrusting your time onto them. Anachronism, wrong time.
The other phrase I've just come across recently, which I really like, is chronological arrogance.
Yes.
And I love that concept that we are very arrogant.
C.S. Lewis said that. I think
Is it-
every
that's where it
generation
comes from.
has arrogance on everything
Everyone
that's
that's
gone
come past.
before.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And
We
so,
must know everything.
yeah,
They
and
don't.
if there's a difference, so they have one way of using numbers of dating, and we have this way of using numbers of dating. Our way is the right way and the best way and the scientific way, and their way is ancient and old, therefore it is primitive and unsophisticated, you know, and it's very arrogant of us.
Surely, if we're taking radiocarbon dating, we can test that. We have different ways of dating, and we can check one to the other, and they do come in fairly
But
well.
then, again, my point would be in
And that's
200
not arrogance.
years from now, in 200 years from now, they're going to have another way of doing it, and we'll look back at it and say that ours was imprecise because theirs would be better.
You can't, with respect, you
Yeah.
can't say in 200 years what they're going to do.
True.
And you know,
But the history of the world would suggest that every generation thinks they have arrived at the
yeah,
answer.
but when
and
we
everyone
have
else didn't.
objective radiocarbon dating, and we can get a piece of radioactive carbon and we can check it out how fast it's ticking by, and we can then date it, and then we can use tree rings or something like that and check those datings. When we can do that and we can find out the range of errors that we got, then that's not arrogance to me, that's just plain common sense.
I think we're talking about two different things here, because part of what I think Melinda's saying is, if then what you do is you say, so we can identify that it was exactly 372 years, based on our framework of how years work and everything like that, and we find that they wrote, oh, it was about 390 or 380 or whatever, and we go, aha, they're 8 years out, so clearly they're wrong. That doesn't show respect for that. That's not how they view time. So it's that's kind of thing. Now it is 9 o'clock. We should probably finish, and I will be giving something to you. So yes, thank you.
Lovely assistant over there.
Yes. Yeah. So I wanted to give you this. So we couldn't tell whether you would want wine or chocolate, so we gave you both. So kind of hedged our bet there. Well, I kind of took a guess. But hey, you can sell the wine.
Oh, thank you very much.
So yeah. So let's thank her again. Thank you.